Ladies and gentlemen, friends and fellow travelers in life. Today, I want to talk about something that touches the very heart of our connections with others, something that has the power to either elevate or destroy every bond we share. That something is ego. We all have one, and that's okay. Ego is a part of us. It's what gives us confidence, pushes us to succeed, and helps us define who we are in this vast world. But when we allow ego to take control in our relationships, we begin to build walls, not bridges. And those walls, though they may seem protective in the moment, only isolate us from the ones we love. Ego has the power to create significant emotional distance between individuals, even when there is a foundation of love, respect, and trust. In relationships, whether romantic, familial, or platonic, ego can slowly chip away at the connection that once felt unbreakable. At its core, ego is the part of us that desires to be seen, heard, and validated, often at the expense of others. When we allow our egos to take the lead in our relationships, we begin to prioritize our own desires and self-importance over the feelings and needs of the people we care about. This shift is subtle but can have devastating effects over time. When ego enters the picture, it can create a sense of superiority or defensiveness, even in the most trivial situations. Instead of approaching a conversation with openness and a desire to understand, the ego often sees every interaction as an opportunity to assert control or establish dominance. It creates an environment where one person feels the need to always be right, while the other feels dismissed, unheard, or unimportant. In the long run, this can result in both people feeling emotionally isolated from each other. For example, consider a couple in the midst of a disagreement. Instead of engaging in a healthy discussion about their differing views, one person might dig in their heels, refusing to listen or compromise, simply because their ego demands to be the one who is correct. The other partner, in turn, might retreat, feeling that their opinions don't matter or that they are not being respected. The conversation, which could have been an opportunity for growth and mutual understanding, becomes a battlefield where both parties protect their egos but lose the connection they once had. The result is not just a disagreement, but a growing emotional distance. Moreover, ego can prevent us from being vulnerable. Vulnerability is essential in creating deep, meaningful connections in any relationship. When we let go of our egos, we allow ourselves to be real and raw, which invites the other person to do the same. But when ego takes over, vulnerability feels like a weakness, and we instead build walls around our hearts to protect ourselves. This defensive stance can leave us feeling alone, even when we're in the presence of someone we love. Ego also feeds on the need for validation. In relationships, this often manifests as seeking constant praise or recognition, believing that the relationship should revolve around one person's needs and desires. This self-centered mindset leads to a lack of empathy as the focus shifts away from the shared needs of the partnership to the demands of the individual. Over time, one partner may feel neglected or unappreciated, creating a rift that was never there in the beginning. What's worse is that ego can prevent us from addressing the real issues in our relationships. When one or both individuals allow their egos to dominate, they often avoid discussing deeper emotional concerns because it feels too vulnerable or uncomfortable. Instead of confronting and resolving problems, they are swept under the rug, leaving space for resentment to build. Without open communication, misunderstandings fester and emotional intimacy diminishes, leading to further isolation. Ultimately, ego acts as a barrier to true emotional connection. It turns what could be a partnership based on mutual love, respect, and growth into a dynamic of power struggles and disconnection. Letting go of ego doesn't mean suppressing your sense of self or your needs. It means putting the relationship above the desire for dominance and embracing empathy, humility, and mutual respect. Only then can we bridge the distance created by ego and rediscover the deep connection that makes our relationships thrive. Ego has a subtle yet powerful ability to create distance in relationships, often without us even realizing it. In its simplest form, ego is our sense of self, our identity, and our way of perceiving the world. While it's natural to have an ego, the problem arises when we allow it to take control in our interactions with others. When this happens, ego creates barriers that prevent us from connecting on a deeper level. The very thing that is supposed to protect us and give us confidence becomes the source of disconnection and misunderstanding. When ego enters a relationship, it causes us to view situations from a self-centered perspective. Instead of listening with the intent to understand, we listen with the intent to respond, defend, or even win. Our immediate reaction becomes one of proving ourselves right rather than seeking mutual understanding or compromise. The need to be right often outweighs the need to be heard or to maintain harmony, leading to tension between partners, friends, or family members. This constant need to assert ourselves can make the other person feel unimportant or unheard, pushing them further away emotionally. Moreover, ego prevents us from acknowledging our mistakes or flaws. In many relationships, being vulnerable and admitting when we're wrong is essential to building trust and intimacy. However, ego resists this vulnerability because it fears that admitting fault will make us appear weak or inferior. Instead of offering an apology or taking responsibility, ego deflects, makes excuses, or shifts the blame. This creates distance because without accountability, the other person is left feeling disrespected or unappreciated. Over time, this lack of openness can erode the trust that forms the foundation of any strong relationship. Ego also fosters defensiveness. When our ego feels threatened, we immediately go on the defensive. This could manifest as raising our voice, shutting down, or responding with anger or frustration. In these moments, rather than addressing the issue at hand, we turn the focus inward, protecting our pride and self-image at all costs. This behavior discourages healthy dialogue where both parties feel safe to express themselves. Instead, it creates an environment where both people feel like they are constantly walking on eggshells, afraid to speak their truth for fear of triggering the other person's defensive reaction. Another way ego creates distance is through comparison. When we allow our ego to dominate, we often begin comparing ourselves to others, even within our relationships. We may start measuring our worth based on how we stack up against our partner, friends, or family members, creating feelings of competition instead of cooperation. This can lead to resentment, jealousy, and insecurity, all of which create emotional distance and strain. Instead of celebrating the uniqueness of each person, ego tries to rank or position them, making one person feel inferior or inadequate. Furthermore, ego thrives on validation. We seek constant approval, recognition, and praise, sometimes to the detriment of the relationship. When we place too much importance on receiving external validation, we risk neglecting the emotional needs of those around us. We may begin to expect others to cater to our desires for admiration, making them feel as though their own needs are secondary. This imbalance creates frustration and emotional withdrawal in those who feel that their own value is being overlooked or diminished. Ultimately, ego operates as a wall between two people, preventing them from truly seeing and understanding each other. In healthy relationships, both parties should feel safe to be their authentic selves, flaws and all. However, when ego dominates, we wear masks, hide our true emotions, and retreat into ourselves, leaving the other person feeling distant, disconnected, and uncertain. The key to overcoming this is humility, recognizing that we don't need to be right, that we don't need constant validation, and that true connection comes from a place of empathy, vulnerability, and mutual respect. Only by letting go of ego can we truly bridge the emotional gap between us and create a deeper, more fulfilling relationship. Ego can be one of the most insidious forces in a relationship, creating emotional distance that is often hard to recognize and even harder to address. It's a barrier that over time chips away at the very connection that brought two people together in the first place. The ego is not inherently bad, as it plays a role in helping us establish self-worth and confidence. However, when it becomes the dominant force in how we interact with others, it can cause serious damage to the intimacy and trust that relationships require to thrive. One of the most damaging effects of ego in a relationship is the way it affects communication. Instead of engaging in conversations with a genuine desire to understand one another, ego causes us to approach discussions with a defensive posture. We may be more focused on defending our views or proving ourselves right than on listening to what the other person has to say. This defensive attitude leads to a breakdown in communication as the other person feels unheard, invalidated, or dismissed. When we allow ego to dictate the way we interact, we create an environment where meaningful dialogue is replaced with shouting matches or passive-aggressive behavior. Over time, this distance grows and the relationship becomes a battleground where both people feel isolated in their own positions, unable or unwilling to connect emotionally. Ego also undermines vulnerability, which is essential for building emotional intimacy in any relationship. Vulnerability allows us to be open about our fears, desires, and weaknesses, and it encourages the other person to do the same. However, ego convinces us that showing vulnerability is a sign of weakness, something to be avoided at all costs. Instead of being open about our struggles or admitting when we are wrong, we hide behind a mask of pride and self-righteousness. This refusal to be vulnerable creates a distance between partners, as both individuals feel they must maintain a certain image rather than embracing the real, imperfect version of themselves. In turn, this creates a sense of emotional disconnect where both people feel like they're living in separate worlds, unable to fully share or experience life together. Another way ego creates distance is through the tendency to prioritize one's own needs and desires over those of the other person. When we are driven by ego, we often see the relationship as something that should serve our personal agenda, whether that's being validated, admired, or in control. Ego can cause us to view our partner as a means to fulfill our own needs rather than as an equal partner with their own needs and desires. This self-centered approach leads to an imbalance in the relationship where one person's emotional needs are consistently prioritized over the other's. Over time, the neglected partner begins to feel emotionally unfulfilled, leading to feelings of resentment, frustration, and ultimately emotional distance. Ego also makes it difficult to apologize or admit when we're wrong. Apologizing requires humility, and ego is the opposite of humility. When we make a mistake or hurt someone, the ego wants to protect us from the discomfort of admitting fault, so it deflects blame, makes excuses, or even tries to turn the situation around on the other person. This refusal to take responsibility for our actions creates unresolved tension and erodes trust. Without the ability to apologize or take accountability, the emotional distance between partners only widens. The other person may feel dismissed, unimportant, or as if their feelings don't matter, which deepens the rift in the relationship. Furthermore, ego often manifests in jealousy, comparison, and competition. Instead of supporting each other's growth, ego fosters a sense of rivalry where one person feels threatened by the other's success, beauty, or achievements. This constant comparison undermines the foundation of the relationship, turning what should be a supportive partnership into one marked by insecurity and competition. Ego wants to be superior, and it cannot bear the idea of someone else shining brighter than itself. This comparison creates unnecessary tension, jealousy, and feelings of inadequacy, which only serve to create emotional distance between partners. In the end, the biggest casualty of ego is the deep, meaningful connection that relationships are meant to provide. Relationships require empathy, compassion, and mutual respect, all qualities that are stifled by an inflated ego. When we let go of our ego, we open the door to deeper understanding, connection, and love. We allow ourselves to be vulnerable, to listen, to grow together, and to make mistakes without fear of judgment. Letting go of ego doesn't mean losing yourself. It means being willing to show up as your true, authentic self, free from the need to protect or promote a false image. Only then can we bridge the emotional gap that ego creates and experience the intimacy and connection we truly seek in our relationships. Ego is a powerful force that can slowly but surely create distance in relationships, whether in friendships, romantic relationships, or family connections. Ego tends to undermine the very things that make these bonds meaningful: understanding, empathy, and emotional connection. Ego, in its essence, is the part of us that wants to be recognized, validated, and to protect our self-image. But when this part of us becomes too dominant, it often leads to behavior that creates separation instead of unity. Instead of nurturing closeness, ego breeds isolation, creating an invisible wall between people that can be hard to tear down. At its core, ego demands attention. It constantly seeks approval and validation, which can be harmful to a relationship. When both individuals are driven by their egos, they spend more time trying to outdo each other or prove their worth than genuinely connecting with one another. This dynamic shifts the focus from mutual growth to individual competition. In a romantic relationship, for example, if one partner is constantly trying to be the winner in every argument or conversation, the other may begin to feel invalidated, unheard, and unimportant. When the focus is on being right rather than understanding each other's feelings, the conversation becomes less about solving problems together and more about winning or defending oneself. This can cause resentment to build up over time as the emotional needs of each person are not being met. One of the most insidious effects of ego in relationships is the inability to listen truly. When our egos are engaged, we don't really hear what the other person is saying. Instead, we are too busy planning our next response, defense, or counter-argument. The deeper meaning behind their words gets lost because we are consumed by our own need to be understood. Communication becomes shallow, and the connection that comes from deep listening and empathy is lost. The ego puts up barriers that prevent us from seeing the other person's point of view, and as a result, we miss out on opportunities for meaningful dialogue and resolution. Over time, this lack of genuine communication leads to a growing distance as both people begin to feel like they are speaking to each other but not really hearing each other. Ego also prevents vulnerability, a crucial ingredient in building trust and intimacy. To truly connect with someone, we must be willing to show our authentic selves, including our flaws, fears, and imperfections. Vulnerability requires humility, and ego often stands in the way of that. It tells us that we need to protect our pride, to be strong and invulnerable, which leads us to hide our true feelings. This may work in the short term to shield ourselves from discomfort, but in the long run, it creates emotional walls between us and our loved ones. Without vulnerability, there can be no real intimacy, and the emotional distance between people continues to grow. Partners, friends, or family members may begin to feel like they're dealing with a version of the person, not the true person themselves, further widening the emotional gap. The ego's impact on relationships is also seen in its difficulty with admitting mistakes. When ego is in control, it becomes very hard to apologize or take responsibility for wrongdoing. Ego fears that admitting fault will damage its image, so it tends to deflect, blame others, or make excuses. This creates a cycle of unresolved conflict where issues are not addressed directly. When people can't admit their mistakes, it makes it difficult to repair the relationship, and both parties are left feeling frustrated and hurt. The person waiting for an apology or acknowledgement feels ignored and undervalued, while the person unwilling to admit their fault builds emotional walls to protect their fragile self-image. This inability to reconcile creates an emotional distance that only deepens over time. Another damaging way ego creates distance is through jealousy and insecurity. When we operate from a place of ego, we often feel threatened by the achievements or success of others. Instead of celebrating a loved one's success, ego compares and competes, which breeds jealousy. In romantic relationships, for example, if one partner feels insecure about the other's accomplishments, they might respond with passive-aggressive behavior, criticism, or withdraw emotionally. This type of behavior stems from the belief that someone else's success diminishes one's own value. Instead of fostering mutual respect and admiration, ego-driven jealousy creates emotional division. Ultimately, ego creates distance in relationships by placing the focus on individual needs, pride, and self-image rather than on mutual respect, understanding, and empathy. Relationships thrive on connection and shared growth, but ego creates barriers to those essential elements. The more we allow our ego to dominate, the further we move away from the kind of open, vulnerable, and trusting relationships that bring us the greatest joy and fulfillment. Only by letting go of the need to protect or inflate our ego can we bridge the emotional gap between ourselves and others, fostering relationships that are rooted in love, humility, and deep emotional connection. Ego's influence in relationships can often be subtle, but its impact is deep and far-reaching. One of the most significant ways ego creates distance is by fostering an inability to compromise. In any healthy relationship, compromise is essential. It's about finding a balance where both people's needs, desires, and perspectives are considered. However, ego often interferes with this process by encouraging a my way or the highway mentality. When individuals are overly concerned with asserting their own will or proving themselves right, they are unwilling to meet the other person halfway. This creates tension as the relationship becomes a series of one-sided demands rather than a cooperative partnership. The more each person holds on to their ego-driven desires, the further apart they grow, unable to meet in the middle. The inability to compromise due to ego can make even small disagreements feel like insurmountable obstacles. Instead of seeing the relationship as a space where both people can grow and evolve together, ego makes everything a matter of personal victory or loss. Each small issue becomes an opportunity to assert dominance, which erodes trust and understanding over time. As the distance between the two people grows, the emotional connection weakens, and both may start feeling more like adversaries than partners. This cycle of conflict and refusal to bend leaves both individuals feeling misunderstood and frustrated, increasing the emotional divide. Moreover, ego often causes people to take things personally, even when the other person's actions or words are not intended as personal attacks. When we're ruled by ego, we interpret neutral or even positive actions as criticisms or challenges. Instead of seeing a disagreement as a healthy exchange of views, we see it as an attack on our identity or value. This leads to defensiveness, where instead of responding calmly or seeking clarity, we react with anger or hurt. When both people are reacting defensively, communication breaks down and the connection becomes strained. The conversation no longer becomes about solving the issue at hand, but about protecting one's own ego. As the emotional walls go up, the bond between them crumbles. Ego also affects relationships by making people resistant to growth and change. The ego is rooted in a need for consistency and control, which makes it difficult for individuals to acknowledge that they are not perfect or that they may need to change. Change, however, is a natural part of life and relationships. As people evolve, so too must their relationships. If one or both partners are too tied to their egos, they may resist adapting to the changing dynamics of the relationship, whether that means adjusting to new needs, evolving emotional intimacy, or simply learning new communication styles. This resistance to change creates stagnation, where the relationship becomes one-dimensional and emotionally unfulfilling. Over time, this lack of growth can create distance as both individuals feel unappreciated or trapped in a pattern that no longer works. Another way ego creates distance is through the tendency to withhold affection or love as a form of control. When ego takes hold, love becomes conditional and performance-based. Instead of giving love freely, people may hold it back until they feel they've won an argument or gotten what they want. This transactional approach to love builds resentment and makes the other person feel like they must earn affection, which undermines the unconditional nature that healthy relationships need to thrive. The withholding of affection, whether physical, emotional, or verbal, sends a message that love is a reward to be earned, rather than something that should flow freely between two people who care for each other. This causes emotional withdrawal, as both individuals begin to feel like they are in a power struggle rather than a supportive, loving relationship. Ego can also lead to unrealistic expectations. When we are driven by ego, we may expect perfection from our partner or from the relationship itself. We want things to go exactly as we envision them, and we expect our loved one to meet all of our needs and desires without fail. When these expectations inevitably aren't met, we feel disappointed, frustrated, or even resentful. Instead of recognizing that no one is perfect and that relationships require work and compromise, we see any imperfection as a failure. This creates emotional distance as both individuals begin to feel like they can never meet the other's ideal standards, and the relationship becomes less about love and connection and more about maintaining an impossible ideal. At its core, ego is about maintaining control, protecting one's self-image, and asserting dominance. But in a relationship, control and dominance only serve to create distance. Relationships thrive on mutual respect, vulnerability, and the willingness to grow and adapt. When ego takes over, these foundational elements are overshadowed by self-interest and defensiveness. As a result, the emotional gap between two people widens, and the relationship suffers. Only by letting go of the need to be right, the need for control, and the desire for constant validation can we begin to bridge the divide and build a stronger, more authentic connection. This requires self-awareness, humility, and a willingness to put the relationship above the ego's demands, ultimately fostering a deeper, more meaningful bond. Ego plays a significant role in fostering defensiveness in relationships, often hindering open and honest communication. At its core, the ego is concerned with self-preservation and protecting one's identity, pride, and self-image. When our ego feels threatened, it reacts by creating walls of defense to shield us from discomfort, vulnerability, or perceived criticism. This defensive posture may seem like an instinctual response to protect ourselves, but in reality, it obstructs genuine connection and understanding between individuals. When we are ruled by our ego, even the most neutral comments or observations can feel like personal attacks. For instance, if a partner expresses dissatisfaction with a particular behavior or situation, the ego can interpret this as a direct threat to one's worth or value. Instead of seeing the feedback as constructive or an opportunity for growth, the ego distorts it, making it feel like an attack. As a result, we may react defensively by denying the issue, deflecting blame, or becoming hostile. This creates an atmosphere of tension and discomfort, where both parties are more focused on protecting their own pride than engaging in a productive conversation. The ego's defensive reaction often involves shifting the focus away from the problem and onto the other person. Instead of addressing the issue at hand, the defensive individual may start pointing out the other person's flaws or shortcomings. This deflection tactic helps preserve the ego by drawing attention away from its own perceived weaknesses. However, this behavior only further fuels conflict and creates distance between the individuals involved. The more we focus on defending ourselves, the less we are able to understand the other person's perspective or acknowledge our own role in the situation. Defensiveness also prevents vulnerability, which is crucial for building trust and intimacy. When we are defensive, we close ourselves off emotionally, refusing to be open or admit when we are wrong. This creates a barrier that prevents authentic communication and understanding. Vulnerability allows us to connect with others on a deeper level, but ego guards against this by convincing us that being vulnerable is a sign of weakness. The longer we remain defensive, the greater the emotional distance grows between individuals, as both people feel misunderstood and disconnected. In the long run, defensiveness driven by ego stifles emotional growth and creates an unhealthy dynamic in relationships. It prevents us from truly hearing the other person and addressing issues in a mature and constructive way. By letting go of the need to protect the ego, we create space for open, honest communication and deeper emotional connection. Only then can relationships thrive and grow in mutual respect and understanding. When ego is in control, even a minor critique or difference of opinion can trigger a defensive response. Instead of taking a moment to reflect or acknowledge the other person's feelings, the immediate reaction is to react, justify, or deflect. For example, if one person points out something that could be improved in the relationship, the person with the inflated ego may quickly argue, dismiss the concern, or attempt to shift the blame onto the other person. This knee-jerk defensiveness doesn't allow for any productive conversation to take place. It's as if the need to protect oneself from being wrong or vulnerable overrides the desire to address the issue at hand. Defensiveness also stems from the ego's deep fear of being judged or rejected. People with a strong ego are often afraid that admitting they are wrong or acknowledging their mistakes will lead to feelings of shame or a loss of respect. So they guard their actions and thoughts with defense mechanisms, convinced that appearing perfect is the only way to maintain their value in the eyes of others. In doing so, they often create a facade of perfection, which prevents genuine connection and inhibits growth within the relationship. The fear of being judged leads to a cycle of defensiveness where nothing can be discussed openly without one person feeling attacked or diminished. The need to be right or to avoid being wrong can also make communication feel like a game of winners and losers. Relationships, however, aren't about proving who is right and who is wrong. They are about understanding, compromise, and finding solutions that work for both parties. When ego dominates, the relationship becomes less about collaboration and more about competition. Over time, this can erode trust and intimacy, as both people feel they are more invested in defending their own viewpoints than in truly listening and supporting one another. To move past this cycle of defensiveness driven by ego, it requires conscious effort and self-awareness. Recognizing when ego is taking the lead in an argument allows individuals to take a step back, breathe, and approach the situation with empathy and humility. Rather than feeling the need to be right, it becomes more important to understand the other person's perspective, acknowledge mistakes, and work toward a solution together. By reducing the role of ego in communication, both individuals can foster a relationship where openness, vulnerability, and mutual respect thrive. Ego often creates distance in relationships by causing us to view others as competitors rather than partners. When driven by ego, we become fixated on our own achievements, desires, and status, and we begin to measure our worth against that of others. This mindset can lead to a sense of rivalry even within close relationships. Instead of celebrating each other's successes, the ego wants to assert superiority and diminish the accomplishments of others, fostering unhealthy competition. This sense of competition doesn't just apply to external achievements, it can spill over into emotional dynamics as well, where we subconsciously try to win in arguments or emotional exchanges. Ego creates competition in relationship, and this competitive mindset also affects communication, as the focus shifts from solving problems together to winning the argument or getting the last word. Instead of approaching disagreements with a mindset of understanding and collaboration, the conversation becomes a contest of who can defend their position better or who can be right. The person with the stronger ego may try to dominate the discussion, not allowing for the other person's feelings or perspective to be fully heard. This creates a power imbalance where the relationship dynamic becomes more about asserting control than fostering a healthy, equal partnership. Competition driven by ego also prevents both partners from being truly supportive of one another. In a relationship where both individuals are working toward mutual growth, there should be space to uplift and encourage each other. However, when one or both partners are more concerned with their own standing or success, they may become less inclined to offer genuine support. Instead, they might dismiss their partner's achievements or feel resentful of their success. This lack of support and mutual respect creates emotional distance, as both individuals feel as though they are operating in isolation rather than as a united team. In the long run, when ego fosters a sense of competition, it diminishes the trust and emotional intimacy in the relationship. Instead of two people working together for a common goal, they become adversaries in an ongoing race for validation and dominance. Relationships thrive on cooperation, mutual respect, and shared success. By allowing ego to take a back seat, both individuals can return to the mindset of partnership and teamwork, where both are celebrated for their individual achievements while supporting each other's growth. Ego creates distance in relationships by making it difficult to truly apologize or take responsibility for mistakes. Apologizing and accepting responsibility for our actions is one of the most powerful ways to repair a relationship, yet ego often prevents us from doing so. When we are caught up in our ego, admitting that we are wrong or that we've hurt someone feels like a direct blow to our self-worth. We fear that apologizing or acknowledging our mistakes will make us appear weak, inferior, or unworthy of respect. This reluctance to apologize creates a barrier between us and the other person, as unresolved issues linger and trust erodes. When ego takes over, we often find ourselves making excuses, deflecting blame, or shifting responsibility onto others rather than taking accountability for our actions. Instead of saying, "I'm sorry I hurt you," the ego wants to justify the behavior, explaining why it was necessary or defending our actions. This leads to a lack of resolution, as the other person's feelings are invalidated and the original issue is never addressed. This not only prolongs conflict but also deepens emotional wounds, as the person on the receiving end feels dismissed or unheard. The longer we allow our ego to prevent us from offering a genuine apology, the more entrenched the emotional distance becomes, making it harder to restore trust and intimacy. Furthermore, the inability to apologize due to ego creates a toxic cycle of resentment. If one partner consistently refuses to take responsibility or acknowledge their role in a conflict, the other partner can begin to feel disrespected, unappreciated, or unloved. Over time, these unresolved issues build up, creating emotional distance. The person who feels wronged may begin to withdraw emotionally, feeling as though their feelings don't matter or that their partner doesn't care enough to make things right. This distance grows as the lack of an apology prevents both individuals from moving forward and healing the relationship. Ego also interferes with the process of forgiveness. When we are unwilling to admit our wrongdoings, it becomes difficult for the other person to fully forgive us. Apology and forgiveness go hand in hand. They are the cornerstone of healing and reconciliation. Without one, the other cannot fully take root. When one person is unwilling to offer a genuine apology, the cycle of hurt continues, and both individuals remain stuck in a state of emotional disconnect. This lack of resolution prevents the relationship from moving forward, and the emotional distance between partners deepens. To restore closeness and rebuild trust, it is essential to let go of ego's grip and embrace the vulnerability that comes with taking responsibility for our actions. A heartfelt apology, free from excuses or deflection, demonstrates care, humility, and a willingness to make amends. It shows the other person that their feelings matter and that we are committed to working together to heal the rift. By allowing ourselves to be vulnerable, acknowledging our mistakes, and offering a sincere apology, we can bridge the emotional gap created by ego and begin the process of restoring emotional connection and intimacy. Ego creates distance in relationships by fostering a lack of empathy, which is essential for understanding and supporting one another. When we are controlled by our ego, our focus shifts from genuinely caring about the other person's emotions and needs to prioritizing our own desires, feelings, and self-image. Instead of trying to understand what the other person is going through, we view their emotions through the lens of our own experiences, often misinterpreting or dismissing their feelings. This lack of empathy creates a disconnect as the person on the receiving end feels ignored or misunderstood. Empathy is the foundation of emotional connection, allowing us to step into another person's shoes and understand their perspective. However, when our ego dominates, we tend to prioritize being heard over listening, defending our own point of view rather than considering how the other person feels. In conversations, we may interrupt, ignore, or invalidate the other person's emotions because we are more concerned with proving ourselves right or maintaining our own image. This kind of interaction creates an emotional gap between people as the other person feels that their feelings are unimportant or that their concerns are not being addressed. Furthermore, ego can make us less compassionate and less willing to support others during difficult times. Instead of offering comfort or assistance, we may feel frustrated by the other person's vulnerability or view their struggle as a threat to our own sense of well-being. For example, if a partner is feeling insecure or overwhelmed, the ego might prompt us to react with impatience or even criticism, rather than offering reassurance or understanding. This response deepens the emotional distance because the person in need feels abandoned or judged, not supported. In relationships, empathy also plays a role in conflict resolution. When we approach a disagreement with empathy, we are more likely to listen, validate each other's feelings, and work together toward a solution. However, when ego takes over, the focus shifts from resolution to winning the argument, and empathy is lost. As a result, issues remain unresolved, and both parties feel more alienated from each other as no true understanding or emotional healing takes place. To overcome the distance created by ego, it is essential to cultivate empathy by practicing active listening, validating each other's feelings, and being willing to see things from the other person's perspective. When we let go of our need to protect our ego and focus on the emotional needs of our partner, we create a space for deeper connection and understanding. This fosters a more supportive and nurturing relationship where both individuals feel valued, heard, and cared for. By prioritizing empathy over ego, we can bridge the emotional gap and strengthen the bond between us. Thank you.